Chapter 8. Ingunn had the child on the third day after Halvard's Mass. When Tora lifted the newborn babe from the floor, the mother clasped her head in her arms and shrieked, as though afraid to see or hear. When Ingunn was put to bed, Tora brought her the child, ready wrapped. "You must look at your son, sister," Tora implored. "He is so pretty. He has long black hair." But Ingunn shrieked and drew the coverlet over her face. Tora had sent for the priest the evening before, when the case looked ill. And as she thought there was little life in the boy, she asked the priest to baptize him before he left. They asked the mother what name he was to have, but she only groaned and hid under the bedclothes. Neither Mannhild nor Tora cared to recall any of the men of their kindred in this child, and so they asked the priest to give him a name. He replied that today the church commemorated St. Eirik, king and martyr, and therefore he would call Ingunn's child after him. Tora Steinfinnsdotter was both angry and sorrowful as she sat with this ill-omened little one, her own nephew, on her lap, and the mother would take no notice of him. On the third day after the birth, Ingunn was very ill. Tora guessed she was suffering from the milk, which was now bursting her breasts. She was unable to move or to bear anyone touching her, and she could not swallow a scrap of food, but complained of intolerable thirst. Tora said it would be much worse if she drank. The milk would then rise to her head. "Not a drop dare I give you, unless you will let me give you Eirik." But still Ingunn would not take her child. In the evening, when Tora was preparing the boy for the night, she chanced to upset the basin of water, and she had no more warm water in the room. For a moment she was uncertain what to do. Then she wrapped a cloth about the naked child and bore him to the bed. Ingunn lay in a feverish doze, and before she could prevent her, Tora had lain Eirik on his mother's arm and gone out. She made no haste in the cookhouse, but all at once she was struck with fear and ran back. In the doorway she heard Ingunn's loud and piercing sobs. Tora rushed forward and pulled back the coverlet. "In God's name, have you done anything to him?" Ingunn did not answer. Eirik lay there, with his knees drawn up to his stomach and his hands to his nose, small and thin and brownish red. The warmth of his mother seemed to do him good. His wide dark eyes looked as though he were thinking. Tora drew a breath of relief. She took the basin that Dala brought her, lifted the boy, and finished washing him. Then she wrapped him in swaddling clothes and carried him back to the bed. "Shall I lay him beside you?" she asked, as indifferently as she could. With a long-drawn plaint, Ingunn raised her arms, and Tora laid the child in them. Her hands trembled a little, but she made an effort to talk in a calm and level voice as she propped her sister up, laid Eirik to her breast, and strove to get him to suck. After this, Ingunn obediently took the boy when Tora brought him and laid him to her breast. But she remained as sorrowful as before, and seemed to have lost heart entirely. She was still in bed when Arnvid came riding one evening to Berg. Lady Mannhild had sent word to Mickelbo as soon as Ingunn was delivered. Arnvid came into the room, greeting Lady Mannhild and Tora so calmly and courteously as though nothing unusual were afoot. But when he came up to the bed and met Ingunn's look of mortal dread, his own face became stiff and strange. A burning flush spread over her face and throat as she fumbled shyly with her thin fingers at her breast, drew her shift together and turned the child's face, which was instantly convulsed in a scream, toward the man. "Ah, is he not what women call pretty?" said Arnvid with a smile, touching the child's cheek with one finger. "It was a shame you made such haste to have him christened. You should have been my godson, kinsman." He seated himself on the step beside her bed and slipped his hand under the bed cover so that he touched the child's head and the mother's arm. It was uncanny the way she trembled. And then came what he was waiting for. Lady Mundhild asked after Olav. "I was to give you all greetings from him. He parted from me at Hamar. He would hasten home now. He thought he could be back here about the middle of July. By that time Ingunn should be strong enough to go south with him." He pressed her arm tightly to make her keep calm. He replied to Mundhild's and Tora's questions, told what he knew of Olaf's plans. All three made as though all was well, though each one knew that they all thought the same. How would life shape itself for these two? Here lay the bride with another man's child at her breast, and the bridegroom knew it, as he rode south to make his house ready to receive its mistress. But at last Arnvid said he would fain speak a few words with Ingunn alone. The two ladies stood up. Tora took the child from its mother to carry it to the cradle. "And this one?" she asked. "It is Olaf's wish he shall go southward with his mother?" "Yes. So far as I understood, that was his wish." Then he was left alone with her. Ingunn lay with closed eyes. Arnvid stroked her under the roots of the hair, wiped away the perspiration. "Olaf bade me stay here till he himself can come and fetch you." "Why so?" she asked in fear. "Oh, you know." He hesitated. "Folk are a little more wary of what they say when there is a danger their talk may reach a man." Beads of perspiration came out on Ingunn's forehead. She whispered almost inaudibly, "Arnvid, is there no way out for Olav, so that he may be free?" "No. Nor has he given any sign," Arnvid added, "that he wished it." "If we besought the Archbishop on our knees, promised to do penance?" "His bishop could give him leave to live apart from you, if Olaf would ask it of him. That he will fetch you home and live with you, this he does of his own free will. But no man can sunder the bond there is between you, so that Olaf could freely take another wife, not even the Pope in Romaborg, as I believe." "Not even if I went into a nunnery?" she asked, trembling. "So far as I know, you must have Olaf's consent to that, and he would not be free to marry again. But to be a pious nun, I think you are the least fitted of women, my poor Ingunn. Then you must remember what Olaf himself said to me. It was he who once staked all upon the judgment of Holy Church in the question whether you two were husband and wife or not. He himself called for Bishop Thorfinn's decree whether your living together were binding wedlock according to God's law, and not fornication, and Lord Thorfinn said yes to that. Strict as this bishop was wont to be toward ravishers and all who violated the honour of women, he claimed on Olaf's behalf that this man should be suffered to do penance and make atonement with Einar's kinsman. Do you understand? Olaf cannot depart from his own word, nor will he either, he says. Now, here I talk on, forgetting that you are still weak. Be easy now, Ingunn. Remember what manner of man Olaf is, stubborn and headstrong. When he wills a thing, he must have it. But you must have heard the saying, trusty as a troll. But it could not be seen in Ingunn that she had plucked up heart. The other women were mightily consoled when they knew for certain that Olav Audunsson would make no ado, but would take to himself the wife he had once claimed in so boastful and headstrong a fashion, and bear with her ill conduct in the meantime. Ingunn's kinsmen, Ivar, her brothers, and Hakon, when they heard of the whole matter, said that Olaf had injured them all so deeply, by first taking the bride to himself, then summoning her guardians before the bishop's court, and finally by killing Einar when he called him to account. It was no more than justice if he held his peace, cloaked Ingunn's shame, and did what he could to put a good end to a bad business. Moreover, Hestviken was far away, and even if folk in the south got to know that his wife had had a child by another man before Olav Audunsson married her, he would not be worse wed than many another good and worthy man. No man in his native district need know more than that, unless they themselves were foolish enough to let it come out that she had already been bound to Olaf before she had the child, in such a way that some priests in any case would say the boy was begotten in adultery. This was pointed out to Ingunn by Ivar and Magnhild. She listened to them, pale-faced and dark about the eyes. Arnvid saw that she was greatly disturbed by what they said. "What say you to this, Arnvid?" she asked one day, when Ivar and Hakon had been sitting with her, discussing their view of the case. She now left her bed in the daytime. "I say," replied Arnvid quietly, "God knows, 'tis an ill thing it should be so. But you must see yourself there is some truth in it." "You say that? You who call yourself Olaf's friend?" she burst out angrily. "That I am, and I thought I had shown it more than once," replied Arnvid. "And I will not deny that I have my part of the blame for the bad turn all this has taken. I counselled Olaf, unwisely perhaps. I was too young and lacking in wisdom, and I should not have stayed in the guest-house that evening when Einar picked a quarrel with us. But I shall do my friend no good, nor will you either, if we hide our heads under our wings and refuse to see that the Steinfinnsons too have some right on their side." But Ingunn burst into tears. "Not even you wish Olaf better than this? None of you count his honour of any worth. No one but me." "No," said Arnvid, "and now he must lie in the bed you have made for him." Ingunn's weeping suddenly stopped. She raised her head and looked at the man. "Ah, Ingunn, I should not have said it. But I have been stretched upon the rack of this case of yours for so long now," he said wearily. "But what you said was true." The child lay in the bed, screaming. Ingunn went and took it up. Arnvid noticed again what he had seen before. Although she handled the little one tenderly and seemed to be fond of him, she always seemed to touch her child rather reluctantly, and she was very clumsy when she had to tend the boy herself. Eirik indeed always screamed and was restless and fretful in his mother's arms. She could only quiet him with the breast for a very little while. Tora said this was because Ingunn was depressed and uneasy, so that she had little milk for him. Eirik was always hungry. This time too he had soon finished sucking, and then he lay grimacing as he pulled at the empty breast. Ingunn gave a little sigh. Then she fastened her clothes, stood up, and began to walk up and down the room carrying the child. Arnvid sat looking at them. "Will you accept it, Ingunn?" he asked, "if I offer to foster the child? I will bring up your son in my house and be to him as I have been to my own sons." Ingunn did not reply at once. Then she said, "You would be a faithful kinsman to the boy, I know that. You had the right to expect that I should thank you for the friendship you have shown me all these years, better than I do. But should I die, you must take care of Eirik. Then it will be easier for me in my last hour." "You must not speak of such things now," said Arnvid, trying to smile. "You who are just up and out of danger." When Eirik was 6 weeks old, the woman came with whom Lady Magnhild had bargained early in the spring, that she should receive and foster a child which would be born in secret at Berg. Now the rumours about Ingunn had got abroad nevertheless. So many different things were said as to who might be the father, but most people thought it was that Icelander who had been so often at Berg last summer. Now he was gone, doubtless run away for fear of the woman's rich kinsman. Now the foster mother, Halvig was her name, came one evening to Berg to ask what had become of the child. She had heard no more of the matter. Before Lady Magnhild had thought of what she should say, Ingunn came forward and said she was the mother of the child and Halvig should take it with her when she went home the next day. Halvig looked at Eirik and said he was a fine child. While waiting for her food, she took him up and laid him to her breast. The mother stood over them and looked on while Eirik took a full draught. It must have been the first time in his young life that he had drunk his fill. Then Ingunn took the child and carried it away to her bed. But the woman was shown into another house where she was to sleep. It was intended that she should ride home some time next morning, before folk were about upon the farms. The sisters were left alone in Asa's house, and Tora lighted the holy candle which they still burnt every night. Ingunn sat on the edge of the bed with her back turned to the child. Eirik lay against the wall, cooing cheerfully. "Ingunn, do not do this thing," said Tora seriously. "Do not send your child away like this. It is a sin to do such a deed unless you are forced to it." Ingunn said nothing. "He is smiling," said Tora with emotion, beaming at the boy. "Look at your son, Ingunn. He can smile now. He is so sweet, so sweet." "Yes, I have seen," said Ingunn. "Many times he has smiled of late. I cannot understand that you can do this. Don't you see that I will not bring this child of mine under Olaf's roof? Ask him to foster this brat that a vagabond clerk has left behind." "Shame on you for speaking in that way of your own child," exclaimed Tora, revolted. "I am ashamed." "Ingunn, be sure you will regret it as long as you live if you do this thing. Sell your child into the hands of strangers. I have now brought myself into such a plight that I can never cease to regret." Tora answered hotly, "You speak truly, and on that score there is no one on earth can help you. With Olaf you have played right falsely. Everyone here thinks that, and your shame falls heavier on him than on the rest of us. But if you will be false to your child too, the guiltless young being that you have housed 40 long weeks under your own heart, I tell you, sister, I cannot believe that even Mary, Mother of God, will pray for mercy on the mother who betrays her own son." "Beware, sister," said Tora once more. "You have wronged us all, and Olaf worst. There is only left this boy. Him you have not yet failed." No more was said between the sisters. They went to bed. Ingunn took the boy with her. She lay with her lips pressed against the silky moist skin of the child's forehead, and heard her sister's words ring and ring again within her. Even as Eirik's little head lay now against her throat, lay Jesus Christ against his mother's bosom in the image in church. What did he think of the mothers who flung a little boy from them? "And he called a little child unto him, and set him in the midst of them." On the wall of the church in Hamar there was a painting where he hung nailed to the cross between two thieves. But beside him stood his mother. Fainting with sorrow and weariness, she watched by her son in his last agony, as she watched over his first sleep in the world of men. She saw it now. She dared not pray to Mary's son for forgiveness of her sins unless she stopped here. She dared not pray for Christ's mother to intercede for her with her son if she held fast to her purpose and betrayed her boy. "Ingunn," whispered Tora, weeping, "I didn't speak harshly to you because I wished you ill. But it will be worse than all the rest if you forsake your child." Ingunn's voice was as hoarse as her sister's as she answered, "I know it. I have seen that you are fond of Eirik. You must try when I am gone. You must look after Eirik as well as you can." "I will, as much as I dare, for Hakon," said Tora. None of the three slept much that night, and just as they had fallen into a doze toward morning, Lady Mannhild came and woke them. The woman was ready to start. Tora watched her sister as she wrapped the child. "I do not believe she will dare to do it," was her hope. Then Lady Mannhild began again with her talk that Olaf had transgressed so deeply against them all that it could not be called sheer injustice if he had to suffer Ingunn to take her child south with her. They need not have it at Hestviken. Olaf could very well have it fostered outside. Then Ingunn seemed hard and resolved, as she carried the child out and gave it to Holvik, and watched her and the little boy who accompanied her ride away with it. At breakfast time it appeared that Ingunn had left the house. Arnvid and Tora ran out to search for her. She was walking hither and thither in the field behind the barn, and, beg as they might, they could not get her to go in with them. Tora and Mannhild were quite bewildered. It was dangerous for a married woman to go out in this way before she had been churched, and what were they to say of a mother in Ingunn's case? Arnvid thought they must send for Brother Vigard, for Ingunn ought to obtain absolution and make her peace with God and the church before Olaf came back, so that they might go together to Mass when he had received her with her kinsman's consent. He himself promised to stay with Ingunn and keep watch over her until he could get her to come in. Once they came right up to the birch grove north of the manor. Arnvid followed close on the woman's heels. Not a word could he find to comfort her. He was as tired as a drudge and hungry. The afternoon was far spent, but when he begged her to use her wits and come in with him, he did not get so much as a word in answer. He might just as well have spoken to a stone. Then she went up to a birch tree, laid her arm against its trunk, and ground her forehead on the bark, uttering groans like those of an animal. Arnvid prayed aloud for God to help him. He guessed that she must be half mad. At last they reached a little knoll where they sat side by side in silence. All at once she tore open her dress and squeezed her breast so that the milk spouted in a thin jet onto the warm rock, where it dried into little shiny spots. Arnvid jumped up, caught her round the waist and set her on her feet, shook her this way and that. "Now you must behave yourself, Ingunn." As soon as he took his hand from her, she let herself fall at full length. He raised her again. "Now you must come in with me, or else I'll take and beat you." Then her tears came. She hung in the man's arms and wept impassively. Arnvid kept her head buried against his shoulder and rocked her this way and that. She sobbed until she could sob no more. Then she wept silently with streaming tears, and now Arnvid could fasten her clothing over her bosom. After that she allowed herself to be half led, half dragged home, till he could hand her over to the women. Late in the evening Arnvid sat out in the courtyard talking to Grim and Dala, when Ingunn came out of her door. As soon as she saw the old people, she halted in fear. Arnvid rose and went up to her. Dala went in, but Grim stood where he was, and as Ingunn came past him by Arnvid's side, he raised his hairy old face and spat at her, so that the spittle trickled down onto his bushy beard. When Arnvid took control of him and pushed him away, he made some nasty gestures and muttered all the coarsest names the thralls of old had for loose women, as he turned after his sister and left the yard. Arnvid took Ingunn by the arm and drew her indoors. "You cannot look for anything else," he said, half in anger and half consoling her, "than to suffer such things while you are here. It will be easier for you when you come away, where folk don't know so much about you. But go in now. You have tempted fate more than enough in running out today, and now the sun is going down." "Stay a little while," begged Ingunn. "My head is burning. It's so good and cool here." It was rather dark for the time of year. Clouds were spreading over the whole sky, and in the north the sunset turned them to gold. A rosy light came over the valleys, and the bay reflected the glory of the clouds. Ingunn whispered, "Speak to me, Arnvid. Can you not tell me something of Olav?" Arnvid shrugged as though impatiently. "I would but hear you speak his name," she said plaintively. "I think you must have heard it often enough these last weeks," replied Arnvid with annoyance. "I am sick of all this long ago." "I meant it not so," she begged quietly. "Not of how useful a man he might be to us and such things. Arnvid, can you not speak to me of Olav, you who love him? For you are his friend." But Arnvid would not say a word. It occurred to him that now he had allowed himself to be tormented year in, year out by these two. He had done so many things which were like cutting into his own flesh and turning the knife in the wound. He would do no more. "Come in now." Tora met them and thought that she and her sister might well sleep in Manhild's house tonight. It was so cheerless in the other house now the child was gone. When they were about to go to rest, Ingunn asked her sister to sleep with Lady Manhild in the chamber. "I am afraid I shall get but little sleep tonight, and sleeplessness is catching, you know." There were 2 bedsteads in the room. Arnvid slept in one, and Ingunn lay down in the other. For a long time she lay waiting for Arnvid to fall asleep. The hours passed. She felt that he was still awake, but they did not speak. Now and again she tried to say a paternoster or an ave, but her thoughts roved hither and thither, and she could seldom repeat a prayer to the end. She said them for Olaf and for Eirik. She herself must be beyond prayers, since she had determined to cast herself into perdition with her full knowledge and will. But since she had to do it, perhaps she would not be given the very hardest punishment in hell, even though she thought it must be an alleviation to know that when she cut the bond between them and plunged into the depth, she left Olaf a free man. She could not feel that she was even afraid. She seemed worn out at last, hardened. She did not even desire to see Olaf again, or her child. Tomorrow Brother Vigard would come, they had told her, but she would not see him. She would not look upward, and she would not look forward, and she recognized the justice of her perdition, since she refused to receive anything that was necessary to her soul's salvation. Repentance, prayer, work, and the further pilgrimage of life, seeing and speaking to those with whom she must dwell if she should try to live on. The thought of all this was repulsive to her. Even the thought of God was repulsive to her now. To look downward, to be alone and surrounded by darkness, that was her choice. And she saw her own soul, bare and dark as a rock, scorched by the fire. And she herself had set fire to and burnt up all that was in her of living fuel. It was all over with her. Nevertheless, she said another paternoster for Olaf. "Make it so that he may forget me." And an Ave Maria for Eirik. "Now he has a mother in me no longer." At last Arnvid began to snore. Ingunn waited a while till she thought he was sound asleep. Then she crept up and into her clothes and stole out. It was the darkest hour. Behind the manor a wing of cloud rested upon the ridge and seemed to cast its shadow over the country. The woods surrounding the farm were steeped in gloom. A thin grey vapour floated over the corn and gathered about the clumps of trees, effacing their outlines. But higher up the sky was clear and white, and was palely reflected in the bay. On the heights beyond the lake there was already a gleam of the coming dawn above the woods. At the gate of the paddock Ingunn stopped and set the stakes in after her. There was not a sound in the summer night but the grating of the corncrake. Dew dripped from the alders on the path by the burn, and there was a bitter scent of leaves and grass in the darkness of the thicket. The grove went right down to the manor hard, and now Ingunn saw that the lake had risen greatly while she had been lying in. The water came over the turf and covered the shore end of the pier. She stopped, uncertain. In an instant terror quickened within her and shattered her hardened resolve. No, for this she had no heart. Wade through the water out to the pier. She wailed helplessly in her fear. Then she lifted up her dress and put one foot into the water. Her heart seemed to thrust itself into her throat as she felt the chill water running into her shoe. She gasped and swallowed. But then she ran on, wading through her own fear, tottering unsteadily over the sharp stones of the beach. The water splashed and gurgled about her with a deafening noise as she went forward. Her foot reached the pier. It was flooded for a good way out. The plank bent between the piles. It gave under her feet and the water came far up her legs. Farther out, the planks were just above the surface, but sank under as soon as she stepped on them. Each time she held her breath in fear of losing her foothold and falling into the lake. At last she reached the extreme end of the pier. It was clear of the surface. There was nothing left of her callousness now. She was beside herself with fright. But her trembling hands busied themselves blindly with what she had thought out beforehand. She took off the long woven girdle which was round thrice about her waist, drew her knife and cut it in two. With one piece she bound her clothes together around her legs below the knees, that she might appear seemly if she should drift ashore. The other piece she tied crosswise over her bosom and slipped her hands beneath. She had thought it might be over sooner if she did not struggle as she sank. Then she drew a last long breath and threw herself in. Arnvid half woke, lay in a doze, and was on the point of dropping off to sleep again when, with a dull thump of the heart, he started up, wide awake, and knew that what had half wakened him was that he heard someone go out. He was on the floor in an instant, and over by her bed, fumbling in the dark. The couch was still warm, but empty. As though still distrusting his own senses, he searched on, along the logs of the wall, the head of the bed, the foot. Then he thrust his naked feet into his shoes, slipped his kirtle over his head, groaning the while. He did not even know how long it was since she had gone out. He set out at a run straight through the corn, and came down into the meadow that led to the lake. There was someone on the pier he could see. He ran across the meadow and heard his own footfalls thudding on the dry turf. On reaching the water's edge, he ran on, waiting until he could strike out and swim. Ingunn awoke in her old bed in Asa's house. At first she was aware of nothing, but that her head ached as though it would burst, and the skin of her whole body was as sore as if she had been scalded. The sunshine poured in. The louver was open, and she had a glimpse of the clear sky. The smoke, which showed blue under the ridge of the roof, turned brown in the bright air outside. It was caught at once by the breeze and whirled among the grass on the roof. Then she remembered, and fell almost into a faint. The feeling of relief, of being saved, was so overpowering. Arnvid came up at once from somewhere in the room. He supported her with one arm and put a wooden cup to her lips. There was tepid water gruel in it, with a flavour of herbs and honey. Ingunn drank every drop, keeping her eyes on him over the rim of the cup. He took it from her and put it on the floor, then seated himself on the step beside the bed, with his hands hanging between his knees and his head bowed. It was as though both were overcome by a sore sense of shame. At last Ingunn asked in a hushed voice, "I cannot think. How was it I was saved?" "I came at the last moment," said Arnvid shortly. "I cannot tell," she began again. "I am so stiff in all my limbs." "Today is the third day. You have lain in a swoon. It was the milk went to your head, I think. And you had grown so cold in the water, we had to pour hot ale and wine into you. You have been awake before this, but you probably do not remember." The bad taste in her mouth seemed worse than before, and she asked for water. Arnvid went out for it. As she drank, he stood and watched her. He had so much at heart that he knew not what to take first. So he said it without more ado. "Olav is here. He came yesterday in the afternoon." Ingunn gave way, sick and dazed. She felt herself sinking down and down. But deep within her there was a little spark which was alive and tried to catch and break into flames. Joy, hope, the will to live, meaningless as it was. He was in here for a little while last night, and he bade us tell him as soon as you were awake. Shall I go and fetch him now? The others are in the hall. It is breakfast time. After a moment Ingunn asked, trembling, "Did Olav say anything? Have you told him of this I have done?" Arnvid's face contracted suddenly. He set his teeth in his lower lip. Then it burst out of him. "Have you no thought, Ingunn, of where you would be dwelling today if you had carried out your purpose? If I hadn't come?" "Yes," she whispered. She turned her face to the wall and asked in a low voice, "Did Olav say that? What did he say, Arnvid?" "He has said nothing of that." After a while Arnvid asked, "Shall I bring Olav in now?" No. Wait a little. I don't want to be lying here. I will sit up." "Then I must send in one of the women. You probably don't have the strength to dress yourself," said Arnvid doubtfully. "Please, not Tora or Manhild," Ingunn begged. Then she sat on the bench by the end wall and waited. She had put on her black cloak without really knowing why she did so, and she held it tightly about her and drew the hood over her head. She was white and cold in the face with fear. When the door opened, she had a glimpse of the man stooping as he came in. She shut her eyes again, and her head sank on her breast. She planted her feet hard against the floor and held on to the edge of the bench with both hands to master her trembling. He stopped when he passed the hearth. Ingunn dared not raise her eyes. She only saw the man's legs. He wore no shoes, but tight-fitting buff-leather hose, split and laced over the instep. She fixed her eyes upon this lacing as though it would save her from her crowding thoughts. Such a fashion of men's hose she had never seen before. But it was cunning. They could thus be made to fit the ankle like a mould. "Good day, Ingunn." His voice went through her like a thrust. She sank yet further forward. Olav came on. Now he was standing just before her. She saw the hem of his coat. It was light blue, came down to the knees, and had many folds. Her eyes stole upward, as high as to his belt. It was mounted with the same silver roses and the buckle with St. Olav's image. He had a dagger with an elk-horn sheath and silver mountings. Then she saw that he was standing with outstretched hand. She laid her thin, clammy hand in it, and his closed about hers. His hand was rough and dry and warm. Quickly she drew hers back. "Will you not look up, Ingunn?" She felt that she ought to rise up and greet him. "No, sit still," he said quickly. Then she looked up. Their eyes met, and they continued gazing into each other's face. Olav felt all his blood being sucked back to his heart. His face was frozen and stiff. He had to set his teeth. His eyelids drooped half over his eyes, and he could not raise them again. Never had he known that a man could be struck so powerless. The boundless pain and distress in her poor eyes. It was that which drew his soul naked up into the light. Away went all that he had thought and determined. He knew right well that they were great and important things that now dropped from his mind, but he did not have the power to hold them fast. He was left with the last, the inmost cruel certainty, that she was flesh of his flesh and life of his life, and this could never be otherwise, were she never so shamefully maltreated and broken. The roots of their lives had been intertwined as long as he could remember, and when he saw that death had had hold of her with both hands, he felt as though he himself had barely escaped from being torn to pieces. And a longing came over him, so intense that it shook him through and through, to take her in his arms and crush her to him, to hide himself with her. "Perhaps you will grant me leave to sit down too." He felt so strangely weak in the knees. Then he seated himself on the bench at a little distance from her. Ingunn's trembling increased. His face had been as hard as stone, grey around the bloodless lips, and his strangely bright blue-green eyes had stared sightlessly under the drooping lids. "Oh God, God, have mercy upon me!" As yet, she thought, she had not fully guessed the extent of the misfortune she had caused. But now she was to know it. She read that in Olaf's face of stone. Now, when she could bear no more, came the worst. Olaf glanced at her under his half-closed lids. "You need not be afraid of me, Ingunn." He spoke calmly and evenly, but there was a slight hoarseness in his voice, as though his throat was not quite clear. "Do not think any more of what I said when I was here last, that I might prove a hard man to you. When I said that, I was still wild about this that has happened. But now I have bethought myself, and you must not be afraid. You shall live at ease in Hestviken, so far as it depends on me." Ingunn said in a low, despairing voice, "Olaf, you cannot. We cannot dwell together in Hestviken after this. How will you live with me there, remembering every day?" "If I must, I can," he said shortly. "There is no help for it, Ingunn. And never shall you be reminded of it by me. You can depend on that safely." Ingunn said, "But you are not one who forgets easily, Olaf. Oh, do you think you could do anything else but remember, every night when you lie down by my side, that another—" "Yes," he broke in. "Then you must remember," he went on, calmly as before, "that Hestviken is a long way off, farther than you might think. You will see, Ingunn, that it may be easier for us than we believe when we live so far away from the places where all this has happened to us. You will never see any sign in me that I remember it," he added hotly. Ingunn said, "Olaf, I am crushed and broken, and if it be true there is no way at all of setting you free, now that I have disgraced myself. But I do not see that it can be so, since they said once that they could part us, although we had been betrothed since we were children, and we had slept in each other's arms." "I have never asked if I could wriggle out of my marriage. In all these years I have counted myself bound and been content that it was so, and I am still content. Such was my father's will. I am not one who forgets easily, you say. No, but I cannot forget this either, that we were betrothed to each other by our fathers when we were so young, and as we grew up together we slept in one bed and ate of one dish, and most of what we owned was in common. And when we were grown up, it was with us as you said. There may be many things for which I must answer before God's judgment seat, he said in a very low tone, so I may well forgive you. That is handsome of you, Olaf, and it is good to know it. But now I will ask you to wait a year, and meanwhile to let this matter pass. I am weary and sick. Maybe I shall not live so long. Then you will be glad that you can take a wife to whom no blemish clings, that no woman without honour has ever been mistress of your house, or brought shame on your bed and board. Be quiet, whispered Olaf huskily. Do not speak of that. When they told me what you tried to do. He stopped, overcome. I shall scarce have the strength to go to such a deed another time, she said, a quiver, a sort of smile passed over her face. I shall be a pious woman now, Olaf, and repent my sins for such time as God wills I shall live. But I believe it will not be long. I believe I bear death within me already. You believe that because you are not yet over your sickness, said Olaf sharply. I am tainted, she wailed, faded. I have lost all my fairness. Everyone says so. Little skill have I had all my days, and now I have lost heart and strength. What profit or joy can you have of such a wife as I? You have sat here and never looked at me once, she whispered shyly. I am not much to look at, I know that, and it is no wonder you are unwilling to come near me. Think of it, Olaf. You would soon feel it unbearable if you had such a wretched wife by your side, day and night, all the time. Olaf's features grew yet stiffer. He shook his head. I saw it already when you came in, she whispered almost inaudibly, and you did not greet me with a kiss. At last Olaf turned his head slightly and looked at her with a melancholy smile. I kissed you last night, more than once, but I don't think you felt it. He passed both hands over his face, then bent forward with both elbows on his thighs and rested his chin in his hands. I dreamed a dream last spring. It was Good Friday night to boot, and I have thought of it often since. I remembered it so clearly when I awoke, and afterwards I have not been able to forget it. Now will I tell you what manner of dream this was. I dreamed I was on a hill in the forest, where all the trees were cut down, so that there was no shade. The ground was hot there, and you lay in the full blaze of the sun on the heather. There was heather and cranberries all around the stumps. You lay still. I don't know whether I thought you were asleep. It is strange. In all these years I have roamed about the world, I often wished you would show yourself to me in dreams. You know that there are means one can use if one would dream of one's dearest friend. Many a time I tried them, though, you know, I never had a very firm belief in such devices. But I used them many times while I was still in Denmark, and also since. But I never saw you. But I dreamed this dream on Good Friday night, and I saw you as clearly as you are sitting there. You still seemed a child. We were both children, I thought, as when we were together at Fretterstein. Your hair had come unplaited, and you had on your old red gown of wadmal, but it had rucked up, and I saw your legs bare to the knee. You were barefooted. Then a viper darted out of the heather. Olaf drew a few heavy breaths. Then he went on. I was so frightened, I could not move. And this seems strange, for I am bold to say that if only I can see the danger, I am not easily frightened. But in this dream I felt a terror beyond bearing. When I think of it, it seems I have never known what terror was before or since. The snake moved through the heather, and I guessed it would strike you. But it did not move all the time after the manner of vipers. Sometimes it thrust its way along as caterpillars do, and then it was no serpent, but a fat, hairy caterpillar. But then it was a viper again, coiling in the grass. It seemed to me I had a knife in my hand, and I thought I would strike the snake over the neck with a stick and kill it. It would be easily done. But I dared not, for it turned into a caterpillar again. Do you remember how I was as a boy? How unspeakably I loathed the sight of worms and caterpillars and maggots, worst of all? I strove to hide it, but I know that you saw it. Again he passed his hands over his face and breathed deeply. I stood there as though stunned. And then the snake lay about your foot, and now it was a viper, and it coiled about your calf, but you slept on as soundly as before. And then the snake raised its head and darted hither and thither in the air and flickered with its tongue. Now I don't know what I shall say. There was a horror in it, yet I was drawn to look upon it. It was as though I waited with delight for it to strike. I saw that now I could easily take it by the neck, but I didn't dare. And I saw that it was seeking out the place on your instep where it could set its teeth in deep. But I felt pleasure in looking on at this. And then it struck. He stopped abruptly with closed eyes and bit his lip. Then I awoke. Olaf strove to speak calmly, but his voice was thick. And I lay and was angry with myself, as you know one often is, when one has behaved in a dream as one would never do awake. For, you know, then I should have killed the snake. And I think I would never have stood idly by and watched my worst enemy asleep if a viper crept up on him, nor would I have thought it any delight to see it strike. But there were not many things in the world that I would not have done for you when we were children. And I have thought and thought upon this dream. Again he broke off abruptly, sprang up and staggered a few steps away from her. Then he turned to the wall and threw himself against it, with his arms raised in a cross and his head buried between them. Ingunn rose and stood as though thunderstruck. Something was happening which she had never dreamt possible. Olaf was weeping. It was as though she had never thought he could. The man sobbed aloud. Strange, rough and raw noises were torn from his chest. He made a great effort and forced himself to silence, but his back quivered, his whole frame was shaken. Then his tears broke out again, at first in little gasping spasms, then another storm of harrowing sobs. He stood with one knee on the bench, his forehead against the wall, and wept as if he could never cease. Ingunn stole up, beside herself with terror, and stood behind him. At last she touched his shoulder. Then he turned round to her, threw his arms about her and crushed her to him. They sank into each other's arms as though both seeking support, and their lips, open and distorted with weeping, met in a kiss.